The sun hung low over the parched valley, its light bending strangely across cracked earth where ripples of water once shimmered. What had long been hidden beneath the depths of the reservoir now lay bare, revealed by the drought that drained the lake to an unnatural stillness. At first glance, it was simply a ghost town returned from the past, skeletal outlines of homes, broken chimneys, rusted iron gates, and streets carved faintly into the soil like scars. But those who ventured closer noticed something unsettling. Outside nearly every doorway, arranged with an order too deliberate to ignore, were shoes. Hundreds of them. Some were scuffed work boots hardened by age, their leather curled like dried leaves. Others were dainty children's shoes, impossibly small, their faded colors speaking of playgrounds and laughter long gone. There were women's heels, men's Sunday shoes, even heavy boots still caked with traces of mud. They weren't scattered or lost. They were placed neatly in pairs, standing guard at thresholds as though their owners had slipped them off before stepping inside, except inside, there was nothing. Just empty silence. The image was grotesquely human. Shoes are among the most personal of belongings, they mold to a person's shape, carrying the imprint of every step they've taken. To see them abandoned in such numbers, lined outside ruined homes, created the impression that an entire population had walked barefoot into the shadows, never to return. Some visitors whispered that the shoes looked too well preserved, too carefully placed, to have been resting underwater for decades. It was as though someone had been there more recently, curating the display, arranging it for eyes yet to come. The silence of the valley pressed heavily on anyone who dared to walk among the ruins. Wind rattled through door frames without doors, tugged at half-buried curtains, and whistled across streets where no laughter or footsteps remained. Reporters sent to cover the phenomenon confessed to unease. One claimed he could hear the faint clatter of shoes shifting behind him, though when he turned, everything was still. A photographer admitted that through her lens, she saw movement inside the skeletal remains of a schoolhouse, only to find emptiness when she lowered her camera. The story quickly spread beyond the region, carried by newspapers, whispered through radio broadcasts, and eventually dissected online. Everyone wanted to know what had happened here. Why was an entire town erased from maps and memories? Why did the water hide it for so long? And most of all, why had the residents' shoes remained, patiently waiting at doorways, as though frozen in time? Historians rushed to propose explanations, labeling the town as one of many lost communities sacrificed for the sake of progress, drowned in the creation of a reservoir. But that explanation didn't satisfy the families who had lived there. They remembered hurried departures, government orders to leave, and promises that the sacrifice was for the greater good. Yet even they could not explain why the belongings of their parents, siblings, and neighbors were displayed this way. For some, the sight was too painful to endure, for others, it confirmed their worst fears, that not everyone had escaped when the waters rose. The shoes became a symbol, captured in photographs that spread across the world. They were haunting not simply because they existed, but because they seemed to speak. Each pair was a question. Each child's shoe asked, "Where did I go?" Each work boot demanded, "Why was I left behind?" And together, they created a chorus of unanswered mysteries that echoed louder than any official record could silence. What should have been a ghost town of bricks and would become something else entirely, a mausoleum without bodies, a crime scene without names, a puzzle without pieces. And as the drought deepened, exposing more of the valley floor, more shoes emerged from the silt, multiplying the questions. Visitors began to say the town itself was trying to tell a story, one that no one alive could fully remember. But the most chilling detail remained unspoken. Shoes lined at doorways suggest an act of preparation, a final ritual before entering a place where shoes are not needed. In homes across the world, people remove their shoes before stepping inside. Yet here, in this drowned town brought back to light, it was as though the residents had all removed their shoes at once, but never stepped inside again. And that single question lingered like a ghost over the cracked earth: where did they go? Before it became a drowned relic and a stage for mysteries, the town was alive with sound, color, and rhythm. Nestled in a fertile valley, it thrived on modest farming, small trade, and the tight-knit fabric of rural life. Families gathered on porches during warm evenings, children chased each other through dirt lanes, and church bells marked the passing of time with a steady comfort. For decades, the town was ordinary, unremarkable even, the kind of place overlooked by maps and histories. Yet within its ordinary streets lay the seeds of a story that would one day grip the imagination of strangers across the world. Shops lined the main street, their signs hand-painted and weathered by sun and rain. There was the grocer's, where barrels of apples and sacks of flour greeted customers at the door. A cobbler worked tirelessly behind smudged glass, hammering nails into soles while gossip drifted in from outside. The diner, with its neon light flickering in the dusk, was where teenagers gathered after school, trading stories and plans for futures that never came to pass. Each corner of the town carried traces of laughter, arguments, and whispered secrets. Among its residents were people whose stories deserved to be remembered. Mrs. Lang, the widowed teacher, who ran the little schoolhouse with stern affection. Her chalkboard still bore faint marks decades later when divers first glimpsed it underwater. Then there was George Halstead, a veteran with a limp, who ran the hardware store and always kept extra nails and tools for anyone who couldn't afford them. Families like the O'Connors and the Millers had lived in the valley for generations, their roots as deep as the oaks that shaded their porches. To them, the valley wasn't just home, it was history, inheritance, and sanctuary. Yet beneath the surface of this idyllic life, faint ripples of unease began to stir. Farmers complained of strangers arriving at odd hours, surveying land with clipboards, making quiet notes. Rumors spread that the government had plans for the valley, a dam, a reservoir, progress dressed as necessity. At first, such whispers were dismissed. After all, progress had always happened elsewhere, never here. But then came the letters. Official documents, stamped and cold, demanding that residents prepare to leave. The letters explained that the town would be sacrificed to make way for water, that every family would receive compensation, that relocation would ensure a better future for all. The language was clinical, stripped of sentiment. But for those who read it, it was like a death sentence delivered in ink. Generations of memories were to be abandoned. Cemeteries would vanish underwater. Churches would be reduced to silt. Some families packed quickly, fearing penalties. Others resisted, refusing to believe such an order could truly erase them. Stories passed down suggest that even before the official evacuation, strange things began to happen. Lights flickering in houses left empty. Tools vanishing from sheds. Cattle found wandering without explanation. One man swore he saw a procession at midnight, dozens of people, silent and barefoot, walking toward the riverbank as though following some invisible command. When asked about it later, he refused to speak again, saying only, "They weren't alive the way you or I are." Despite growing tension, daily life continued in strange limbo. Children still played, shopkeepers still opened their doors, and Sunday services were still held. Yet every hymn, every transaction, every shared meal was underscored by the knowledge that it could be the last. The sense of a countdown thickened the air. For some, denial was the only way to cope. For others, superstition grew stronger, whispers of an old curse tied to the valley, warnings that the land itself would exact a price for being disturbed. The shoe-lining custom had not yet appeared, but neighbors remembered odd conversations about thresholds and doors. Old Mrs. Carter, known as something of a mystic, told children that shoes were protectors, guardians meant to keep evil from crossing into a home. Her words were dismissed as harmless eccentricity at the time. Years later, when the town resurfaced and shoes were found at every doorway, her warnings would echo with chilling weight. As the date of evacuation drew near, tension divided families. Some prepared to leave, resigned to losing everything. Others vowed to stay, to defy the order no matter the consequence. Arguments broke out in kitchens, tears were shed in bedrooms, and whispered promises were made, to reunite, to remember, to never forget where they came from. But promises are fragile things, easily broken by forces too great to resist. The town stood at the edge of transformation, unaware that its last days would not end with neat relocation, but with mysteries that would haunt the valley forever. For in those final weeks before the flood, people began vanishing without explanation. A neighbor here, a family there. At first, excuses were made: they must have left early, they must have gone to relatives in another state. But when doors stood open and meals were left half-eaten, unease hardened into fear. And then, as if overnight, the government's patience ran out. Officials arrived in unmarked trucks, engineers measured the valley one last time, and the slow countdown came to an abrupt, terrifying halt. The flood was no longer a distant threat, it was imminent. The morning the order came down was deceptively ordinary. The sun rose over the valley, golden light spilling across the rooftops, and the air was thick with the sound of birdsong. But there was an unnatural stillness to the people. Neighbors stood outside their homes, clutching suitcases, staring at trucks that rumbled into town. Officials barked orders with military efficiency, handing out forms, shouting deadlines. This was no gradual departure. It was sudden, urgent, and frighteningly final. Families scrambled to gather what they could. Photographs were stuffed into bags, clothes into crates, children clutched tightly by anxious parents. But what about the things too large to carry? Pianos, heavy wardrobes, even heirlooms passed down through generations, all had to be abandoned. Some residents tried to argue, pleading for more time. But the officials' response was curt: the water was coming sooner than anyone had expected. There would be no extensions, no delays. In the chaos, something darker began to unfold. Witnesses later claimed that not everyone made it out. One man swore he saw the Wilcox family still inside their farmhouse as trucks rolled away, yet when he returned to check, the house was empty, food still steaming on the table. Another recalled hearing a baby cry from a distant barn, but by the time he reached it, the sound had vanished, leaving only silence and straw scattered across the floor. By dusk, the valley had become a patchwork of abandoned homes and half-empty streets. Those who left described looking back one final time, seeing neighbors waving farewell from porches. But what unsettled them most was how some houses stood with doors wide open, shoes neatly placed on the steps, as though the occupants had vanished in the middle of preparing to leave. These weren't isolated incidents. Dozens of accounts described the same sight, repeated again and again. Government records would later insist that the evacuation was orderly, that every citizen had been relocated safely. Yet survivors whispered otherwise. They remembered missing families, empty carriages on the trains meant to carry people away, and names never called on resettlement lists. Even more disturbing were the stories of strange figures moving at night in the days just before the flood, shapes seen slipping between barns, shadows standing at windows, and the eerie sound of footsteps echoing long after streets should have been deserted. Then came the flood itself. Engineers released the waters with ruthless precision, opening sluices that turned trickling rivers into roaring torrents. The valley began to fill, slow at first, then faster as the current devoured farmland, barns, and fences. People watching from the hills described the sound as deafening, a deep, unrelenting roar that drowned out every other noise. Homes were swallowed one by one, their roofs vanishing beneath the rising tide. The church bell rang once, either struck by the current or by some unseen hand, before the steeple collapsed and disappeared forever. For those who had lived in the valley, the sight was unbearable. Many wept openly as they watched generations of history vanish beneath the churning water. Some clutched crosses, others cursed the officials, but all felt the same hollow despair. Yet amid the grief, a more sinister realization gnawed at them: if the town was submerged so quickly, what of those who hadn't left in time? Were they trapped inside? Did they drown, unseen and unrecorded? Or were they already gone, taken by something else before the waters ever arrived? Survivors carried that question with them long after relocation. Some refused to speak of it, burying the memory like the town itself. Others couldn't let it go, haunted by dreams of water rushing through streets, of shoes floating past their windows, of voices calling to them from below. And then there were the rumors, too many to dismiss, too persistent to ignore. Families missing from official records. Trains that left with empty seats. Entire households simply erased as though they had never existed. The official narrative was simple: progress demanded sacrifice, and the valley was sacrificed for the greater good. But beneath that narrative was a shadow that refused to fade. What truly happened to those who never appeared in resettlement towns, who left behind no forwarding addresses, no signatures, no proof of survival? Their homes, now drowned beneath the reservoir, seemed to whisper an answer too terrifying to speak aloud. As the last rooftops disappeared beneath the water, the valley was gone, replaced by a vast, placid lake that glittered in the sunlight. On its surface, everything looked calm, clean, and controlled. But underneath, secrets slept, secrets pressed into silt, hidden by currents, and silenced by time. And though officials declared the project a success, those who stood at the shoreline that day knew differently. They had seen the shoes at the doors. When the waters finally swallowed the town, silence settled over the reservoir. To outsiders, the new lake was nothing more than a triumph of engineering, a steady supply of water and electricity, a resource that symbolized progress. But to those who had lived in the valley, the lake was no shining emblem of the future. It was a grave. And graves rarely stay silent for long. It began with whispers among fishermen. On still nights, when the water was smooth as glass, they claimed they could hear sounds rising from below. Not just the hum of water or the creak of boats, but voices, faint, muffled, as though carried through stone. One man swore he heard children laughing, the sound echoing across the lake when no one was near. Another refused to return after he heard church bells tolling beneath the waves, even though the steeple had been destroyed long ago. At first, such stories were dismissed as imagination, the mind's way of filling silence with memory. But then came the lights. Locals began reporting eerie glows flickering beneath the surface, pale orbs that drifted like lanterns through the drowned streets, appearing and vanishing without warning. Sometimes they moved slowly, as if carried by unseen hands, other times they darted like sparks, vanishing when anyone tried to get close. Divers, too, returned with unsettling tales. One spoke of entering a submerged house, only to find objects arranged with disturbing precision. Chairs still circled a table, cutlery resting neatly on plates as though dinner had just been interrupted. In another home, he found rows of shoes lined outside a door, undisturbed despite decades underwater. It looked like they'd just been set there yesterday, he told a friend, before abandoning diving altogether. The most unnerving stories, however, came from those who never even touched the water. Campers along the lakeshore woke to sounds of footsteps circling their tents, only to find nothing when they unzipped the flaps. Families picnicking at the edge of the lake swore they heard knocks echoing from beneath the surface, like someone rapping insistently on wood. Some claimed to see faces ripple across the water, eyes staring up at them with silent accusation. As tales spread, the drowned town slipped into folklore. People began calling it cursed, a place where restless spirits still wandered the streets that no longer existed. Parents warned children not to play too close to the water, telling them the lake would pull you under, to join the others who never left. Whether meant as caution or truth, the stories planted seeds of dread that flourished in every retelling. Of course, officials and engineers scoffed at such claims. They argued that shifting currents and the creaks of underwater structures explained the noises. Glowing lights were dismissed as natural gases, or reflections of stars distorted by rippling water. But explanations did little to quiet the unease. For every rational answer, another tale arose that defied it. One of the earliest explorers to dive into the ruins reported finding something that shook him deeply. Beneath a collapsed roof, half buried in silt, he discovered not just shoes but bones, scattered, unaligned, and far from where they should have been. The diver described them as wrong, though he could never explain exactly why. Perhaps it was the way they lay, as though tossed about, or perhaps it was something else, something he refused to put into words. The discovery was quietly reported to authorities, but the evidence disappeared. The diver himself abandoned the profession soon after, plagued by nightmares of hands reaching for him in the dark. Despite the fear, curiosity only grew. Adventurers, journalists, and paranormal enthusiasts flocked to the lake, hoping to glimpse its secrets. Some returned with photographs showing faint outlines of rooftops, doors, and windows shimmering below. Others returned shaken, refusing to speak about what they had seen. And still others never returned at all. A handful of divers vanished without a trace, their bodies never recovered, fueling rumors that the town itself demanded offerings for disturbing its rest. The folklore gained a ritualistic edge. Locals began leaving pairs of shoes at the edge of the water during droughts, echoing the town's eerie image. Whether as tribute, appeasement, or out of superstition, no one could say. Yet each new offering blurred the line between legend and reality, reinforcing the town's haunting presence. By the late 1970s, the drowned town was no longer just a piece of forgotten history. It was an obsession. Theories spread through whispered conversations and late-night gatherings, that the town had never been fully evacuated, that families were left behind, that the government had buried something far more sinister beneath the waves. Each story fed into the next, weaving a tapestry of dread that no official report could unravel. And then, one man, a diver, reckless in his curiosity and desperate for truth, claimed to have proof. He said he found not only rows of shoes preserved in the silt but something else, something the authorities did not want the public to see. He returned with evidence that would change the story forever. The drought of the late 1970s exposed parts of the reservoir not seen since the valley was flooded. The shoreline receded, pulling back to reveal jagged silhouettes of chimneys and rooftops poking above the waterline like skeletal fingers. With each passing week, curiosity grew. Locals gathered at the edges of the lake, staring down at the half-revealed ruins, their imaginations stoked by the stories that had haunted the region for decades. It was in this atmosphere of fascination and dread that a young diver named Thomas Renner decided to plunge into the drowned town. Thomas was no ordinary adventurer. He had served as a Navy diver before returning to civilian life, where the monotony of ordinary jobs left him restless. When he heard of the drowned valley, he felt the pull of mystery like a physical force. Friends described him as a man both brave and reckless, someone who seemed to believe he was invincible underwater. To him, the stories of voices and lights were nothing more than local superstition. He wanted truth, and truth, he believed, was waiting beneath the lake. On a gray morning, armed with oxygen tanks, lights, and an old waterproof camera, Thomas descended into the murky depths. At first, visibility was poor. The water was thick with silt, stirred by decades of decay, but as he swam deeper, outlines began to appear. Broken rooftops jutted from the mud. Doorways stood ajar like gaping mouths. A rusted sign still clung to a storefront, its letters half-legible, Halstead Hardware. Thomas hovered before it, his breath rasping in his ears, struck by the eerie preservation of the place. It was as though time itself had stopped when the waters came. Venturing further, he found an entire row of houses intact. And there, outside each door, arranged with chilling symmetry, were shoes. Rows upon rows of them, standing as neatly as if they had been placed only yesterday. Some were covered in a fine film of silt, others astonishingly clean. But the sight that froze Thomas was not just their presence, it was their condition. After decades underwater, leather and cloth should have decayed beyond recognition. Yet many of these shoes still bore clear detail, stitching, laces, even faint impressions of the feet that once wore them. It was as though they had been waiting for him. Thomas's notes, later recovered from his journal, described the moment he realized something was wrong. "The shoes aren't random," he wrote. "They're deliberate. Every pair points inward, toward the door, as if waiting for their owner to return." The implication disturbed him deeply. These weren't forgotten belongings scattered by disaster. They were placed with intent. As he swam into one of the houses, his light beam fell on something pale buried in the silt. At first he thought it was wood, but as he brushed away the mud, his glove touched smooth bone. A jaw. A fragment of a rib. Then more, scattered in unnatural positions. Not a skeleton lying where someone had fallen, but fragments spread across the floor as if thrown or deliberately arranged. Thomas recoiled, his breathing quickening. He shined his light further, and in a corner of the room, beneath a half-collapsed dresser, lay a skull staring blankly through the water. He rose quickly to the surface, shaken but exhilarated. He told friends what he had found, showing them a sodden notebook filled with rough sketches of shoes outside doors and notes about bones inside. He even produced a photograph, blurred, but unmistakable in its outline, of the shoes lying neatly on a submerged porch. The reaction, however, was not what he expected. Authorities descended almost immediately. Officials from the Water Authority and state police interviewed Thomas, confiscated his camera, and dismissed his story as fabrication. They claimed the photograph was inconclusive, the bones likely animal remains, and warned him against spreading dangerous rumors that might deter tourists or damage the dam project's reputation. Friends noticed that Thomas grew paranoid afterward, convinced he was being followed. He continued to dive in secret, hoping to gather irrefutable proof. But the deeper he went, the more disturbed he became. He claimed the shoes seemed to multiply, appearing in places he had not seen them before. In one dive, he swore he heard the distant toll of a bell, though he was nearly half a mile from the old church. On another, he felt something tug at his fin, a sudden, sharp pull that sent him spinning into the mud. When he surfaced, he was trembling, insisting that, "They don't want me down there." By the early 1980s, Thomas's obsession had consumed him. His friends drifted away, unable to watch him unravel. His marriage collapsed. He spent nights drawing maps of the drowned streets, marking the locations of shoes and bones he claimed to have found. His journals grew frantic, filled with warnings about the valley and scribbled sentences repeating, "They're still there. They never left." Then, one night, Thomas vanished. His boat was found drifting at the edge of the lake, lights still on, air tanks neatly stowed. But Thomas himself was gone, leaving only his last journal entry, "I know where they are. I'll bring them up this time." His body was never recovered. Locals whispered that the town had claimed him, punishing him for disturbing its rest. Officials insisted he drowned in an accident, his obsession leading him to take risks beyond reason. But the divers who followed in his footsteps reported eerily similar experiences, strange sounds, unexplained movements, and the ever-present rows of shoes, watching them silently from the doorways. And so, Thomas Renner's discovery, part evidence, part legend, part nightmare, became a cornerstone of the town's mystery. His photograph circulated in underground circles, too blurred to be definitive but haunting enough to convince many that something unspeakable slept beneath the water. Years later, when another drought would finally expose the drowned town to open air, Thomas's name would resurface too. People remembered his warnings, his obsession, and his disappearance. And they wondered, with growing dread, whether he had truly been lost, or whether he had joined those who never left the valley. In the summer of 1993, the region faced one of the worst droughts in living memory. The reservoir, once thought endless, began to shrink under the relentless heat. Each passing week pulled back more of the water, and soon the outlines of long-buried rooftops pierced the surface. Word spread quickly, and people traveled for miles away to witness what many had called a legend, the ghost town rising from its watery grave. Families camped by the shorelines, journalists snapped photographs, and thrill-seekers walked into the newly revealed ruins. For the first time in decades, the valley could be seen with naked eyes, a skeleton town resurfacing under the unblinking sun. What people found was disturbing. Houses that had been submerged for nearly half a century stood with eerie resilience. Wooden beams jutted out, still upright, as if refusing to rot. Rusted metal fences encircled yards where no grass had grown in generations. A church steeple leaned sideways, but the iron cross atop it remained defiantly intact. Yet what unsettled visitors most was the state of the interiors. Despite decades underwater, many homes looked as though families had only just left, furniture still upright, curtains clinging to windows, toys scattered across cracked floors. Then came the shoes. Just as Thomas Renner had described years earlier, shoes appeared neatly placed outside the doors. Entire rows of them, untouched by mudslides or shifting currents, stood in chilling alignment. Visitors spoke of sneakers, boots, even delicate leather slippers, all positioned as if waiting for their owners to step back into them. Some laughed it off as coincidence, others insisted it was evidence of something deliberate, something ritualistic. Photographs were taken, and for the first time, visual proof circulated widely. The images showed shoes caked with dried mud, yet their arrangement was too precise to ignore. Reporters latched onto the story, dubbing the place, "the town that refuses to die." Local officials scrambled to control the narrative. They dismissed the shoes as the result of underwater currents, claiming that silt and water movement could have pushed objects into neat rows. But skeptics pointed out the flaw: currents scatter, they do not arrange. And no current could place shoes directly at doorways across multiple streets, as though guided by invisible hands. As more of the town resurfaced, darker discoveries followed. Skeletons emerged from the mud. At first, officials insisted these were animal bones, but forensic experts quietly admitted that several sets were undeniably human. Some skeletons were found inside houses, collapsed near doorways, but others were uncovered in bizarre positions, fragments scattered, ribs separated from spines, skulls resting on windowsills as if deliberately placed. To many, this suggested not a natural disaster but something else entirely: violence, ritual, or both. Crowds flocked to the site, treating it like a macabre tourist attraction. Paranormal enthusiasts filmed themselves wandering through the cracked streets, daring each other to step into the church whose bell had allegedly tolled underwater. Others claimed to hear whispers at night, drifting across the exposed valley. Campers spoke of voices calling their names, of laughter echoing through the ruins. One group reported waking to find shoes lined outside their tents, though none of them admitted to placing them there. The authorities finally stepped in, cordoning off large portions of the area. They cited safety concerns, warning of unstable structures and sudden sinkholes, but rumors spread that the real reason was to cover up the disturbing remains. Some whispered that the state feared what would be uncovered if outsiders kept digging: proof of mass graves, evidence of a forgotten atrocity. Among the discoveries that could not be denied was the old schoolhouse. When its roof emerged from the water, people gathered in droves, drawn by curiosity. Inside, desks still stood in neat rows. Textbooks lay open, their pages warped but legible. On the blackboard, faint chalk marks remained, a half-finished arithmetic problem, frozen mid-lesson. But at the back of the classroom, near the collapsed door, lay something that silenced even the loudest skeptics. Dozens of shoes, small and fragile, lined neatly against the wall. Children's shoes. The image of those tiny shoes sparked outrage and horror. Newspapers published photographs, fueling national interest. Conspiracy theories exploded. Some claimed the valley had been the site of cult activity before the flooding. Others suggested a cover-up of mass killings during the town's evacuation. The more rational voices argued that the shoes had simply been left behind during the hurried exodus and preserved unnaturally by the water. Yet no explanation satisfied the public, for the arrangement of the shoes was too precise, too intentional. Local elders, when pressed for answers, grew evasive. Some admitted that people had gone missing before the dam was built, vanishing without explanation. Others muttered of a curse, claiming the valley had been claimed by the dead long before the water came. One elderly woman, who had been a child in the town, gave an interview in which she whispered, "We were told never to touch the shoes. They weren't ours. They never belonged to us." She refused to elaborate further. The drought ended abruptly in early autumn. Heavy rains returned, and slowly the waters crept back over the ruins. By winter, the town was gone again, buried beneath the lake. But the memories lingered. Photographs of the skeletons and shoes continued to circulate, many suppressed by officials but preserved in underground circles. The schoolhouse, with its rows of children's shoes, became the most enduring symbol of the resurfacing. For believers, it was proof that the town's story was not one of simple flooding but of something darker, something deliberately hidden. And as the waters swallowed the ruins once more, a new fear took hold: the town would not stay buried forever. Each drought, each dry summer, risked pulling it back into the light. And each time it surfaced, the dead seemed to return with it. When the rains finally restored the reservoir, many assumed the story would fade with the resubmergence of the ghost town. But instead, it only grew darker. The resurfacing had awakened something, whether memory, rumor, or something far more sinister, and soon the disappearances began again. It started subtly, almost dismissively, with hikers who never returned from weekend trips near the lake. Their cars were found parked along the gravel lots, their belongings untouched inside, but no trace of them could be found in the woods or along the shoreline. Search parties combed the area, dogs were brought in, helicopters scanned from above, but the trail always ended at the water's edge, as if the missing had simply walked into the lake and vanished beneath its surface. At first, authorities brushed these cases off as accidents, drownings, animal attacks, perhaps people who intentionally wandered off. But then the numbers grew. By the end of the summer following the drought, nearly a dozen individuals had disappeared within a 10-mile radius of the reservoir. Locals whispered that the town beneath the water was claiming new victims, pulling the living down to join the dead who had been left behind. Parents warned their children to stay away from the lake, fishermen refused to cast their lines, and campers reported unsettling experiences: shoes appearing outside their tents, wet footprints circling their campsites, and in one case, the sound of children giggling in the dead of night. The case that pushed the story into national headlines involved a young journalist named Emily Krieger. She had been researching the resurfaced town for a documentary, determined to piece together its hidden past. Friends later revealed that she had grown obsessed with the shoe phenomenon, carrying notebooks filled with sketches and transcriptions of witness accounts. She returned again and again to the lake, often at night, leaving behind frantic audio recordings in which she described figures standing just beneath the surface, waiting, watching. On her final recording, her voice quavered as she whispered, "They don't want to stay buried anymore." Days later, her car was found abandoned near the access road. The driver's side door hung open, keys still in the ignition. On the passenger seat, neatly arranged, were a pair of shoes, not hers. She was never seen again. The disappearance of Emily Krieger sparked public outrage. Vigils were held, petitions demanded a full-scale investigation, and amateur sleuths pored over her notes, convinced she had stumbled upon something hidden deliberately. Some argued she had been silenced because she was close to uncovering the truth about the valley's history. Others suggested she had become a victim of the same curse she had been investigating. Her parents released a statement urging others not to chase the mystery, warning that, whatever took our daughter is still out there. But far from deterring the curious, the warning drew more adventurers, paranormal investigators, and conspiracy theorists to the lake. The disappearances grew bolder. Campers reported seeing pale figures at the edge of their fires, silhouettes that vanished when approached. One man swore he woke to find a child standing in the doorway of his tent, barefoot, dripping with lake water. When he blinked, the figure was gone, but a small pair of muddy shoes remained where it had stood. In another case, a fisherman's body was later found floating near the dam, his boat intact but his feet bare, his shoes lined neatly at the stern as though placed with care. The sheriff's office called it suicide, but those who saw the scene disagreed. His shoes were dry, spotless, untouched by the mud and water that soaked his body. The escalation terrified residents, but the authorities remained dismissive, calling the story's hysteria amplified by urban legend. Yet even among officials, unease grew. One deputy later admitted anonymously to a local newspaper that their search team had stumbled upon a shallow grave near the reservoir. Inside were bones, not decades old, but fresh. The grave was lined not with dirt, but with shoes. The report was buried, never officially confirmed, and the deputy who spoke out resigned shortly after. Meanwhile, the lake itself seemed to change. Visitors described the water as darker, thicker, and strangely warm in patches. Fishermen pulled up nets filled not with fish but with twisted debris, children's toys, rusted cutlery, broken furniture, objects believed to have belonged to the original townsfolk. Some even claimed the items were impossible. Modern shoes, styles that hadn't existed before the dam, appeared coated in fresh mud at the shoreline. As one paranormal researcher remarked, it's as though the lake is feeding itself new history, creating new ghosts for an old story. By the turn of the millennium, the reservoir had become notorious nationwide. Television crews camped along its banks, filming specials about America's drowned town. Psychics held seances by the water's edge, claiming to channel voices from below. One medium, broadcast live, suddenly screamed during her performance, clutching her throat as if strangled. The cameras kept rolling as she collapsed, and though she survived, she swore that cold hands had dragged her under. Afterward, she refused to speak publicly about the incident, and her career quickly unraveled. For locals, life near the lake became unbearable. Businesses closed, tourism plummeted, and property values collapsed. Residents begged the state to drain the reservoir permanently, but officials insisted it was too vital to the region's water supply. Draining it, they argued, would leave thousands without resources. Yet some whispered that the true reason for keeping the lake full was fear of what would be exposed if the town were uncovered again. If a few months of drought had revealed skeletons and children's shoes, what horrors might lie buried deeper still? The disappearances continued sporadically, but by then, the public had grown desensitized. People began to treat the lake as cursed land, a forbidden zone where the rules of nature no longer applied. For the families of the missing, however, the pain never dulled. Every empty chair at dinner, every birthday without celebration, served as a reminder that their loved ones had vanished into a silence that gave no answers. Shoes were left behind, neatly placed at thresholds, at campsites, on car seats, silent markers of absence, reminders of lives erased without explanation. As the new century progressed, a chilling realization settled over the community. The resurging curse of the lake was not a relic of the past, nor was it tied only to the drowned town. Whatever force haunted those waters was alive, adaptive, and patient. It was not content to rest beneath the surface. And if history was any indication, the disappearances were only the beginning. As the disappearances mounted and the legend of the drowned town deepened, speculation took on a life of its own. In coffee shops, university halls, and late-night radio programs, theories about the valley's mystery multiplied, each one darker and more elaborate than the last. Some drew upon folklore, others leaned on science, while still others insisted that powerful forces were actively suppressing the truth. What bound them all together was a single, terrifying idea: whatever had happened in that valley, and whatever continued to happen, was not an accident of nature but something designed, deliberate, and unspeakable. The first wave of theories came from local historians. They pointed to long-buried records that revealed the government had forced residents from their homes with astonishing speed before the dam was completed. Families were given days, sometimes hours, to pack their belongings and flee. Entire blocks were abandoned mid-meal, mid-school, mid-life. Officially, this haste was blamed on engineering deadlines and the urgency of water needs, but conspiracy theorists saw a different motive: the authorities wanted the valley drowned before anyone had time to ask questions. What were they hiding in such a rush? Some suggested that the valley had been home to a secret institution, perhaps a psychiatric hospital or a military research site. Declassified documents hinted at experiments conducted in isolated rural areas during the early 20th century, ranging from chemical exposure tests to psychological manipulation. According to this line of thought, the shoes at the doorways were remnants of some failed ritual or experiment, the last traces of subjects who never escaped. Supporters of this theory cited eerie consistencies: rows of shoes as evidence of conditioning, the skeletal remains as signs of neglect, and the town's submersion as a cover-up to erase a national embarrassment. Another theory tied the shoes directly to folklore. Local Native American stories described the valley as cursed long before settlers arrived. One tale spoke of a river spirit who demanded tribute, shoes left at thresholds to ward off its anger. Those who failed to comply, the legend warned, would be taken by the water. Folklorists pointed out that the drowned town's shoe phenomenon mirrored this ancient tradition, suggesting that the settlers had unknowingly reignited a curse by disturbing the land. Believers insisted that each new disappearance proved the curse was ongoing, a cycle that could not be broken by dams or water levels. Meanwhile, the paranormal community offered its own interpretations. To them, the shoes were offerings to the dead, either left behind by the victims themselves in some compelled trance or placed afterward by unseen hands. Ghost hunters who visited the area swore their equipment malfunctioned whenever they neared the old foundations. EVP recordings picked up whispers, one chillingly clear, "We're still here." Skeptics dismissed these as tricks of static and suggestion, but those who listened could not shake the dread of hearing voices trapped between water and stone. Then came the theory that unsettled people most, not folklore, not spirits, but government silence. Investigative journalists began noticing patterns. Missing persons reports near the reservoir were consistently underreported in official statistics. Cases were quietly closed as accidents without proper investigation. Witnesses who came forward with photographs or stories often claimed they were visited by officials urging them to keep quiet, for the sake of public safety. One family even alleged that their son's disappearance was erased from police databases entirely. The implication was clear: someone in power was ensuring that the full scope of the mystery never reached the public. Evidence of suppression grew harder to ignore. Photographs taken during the 1993 drought showed the rows of children's shoes inside the schoolhouse. Yet, when these same photographs were requested through official archives, they appeared heavily altered, the shoes gone, the rooms empty. Independent researchers accused the state of doctoring images to maintain a narrative of simple resettlement. Why erase the shoes if they were nothing more than discarded belongings? Why sanitize the past if there was nothing to fear from it? Forensic specialists also weighed in. Some argued that the skeletal remains retrieved during the drought displayed irregularities inconsistent with natural drowning. Bones bore marks of blunt trauma, ribs appeared broken in patterns suggesting violence, not collapse. Yet no official reports acknowledged these findings. Every recovered skeleton was filed under the same cause: accidental death during evacuation. Families of the victims were told there would be no further inquiries, their pleas for answers drowned as efficiently as the town itself. Of all the theories, perhaps the most chilling suggested that the drownings were never an accident, nor a side effect of flooding, but an intentional act of sacrifice. According to this idea, the town was selected not just for its location but because it had already been marked, cursed land that demanded offerings. The rows of shoes, the scattered bones, the silent schoolhouse, all signs of ritual. The government, fearing the spread of hysteria, may have chosen to flood the valley, sealing the ritual beneath water in hopes that it would never resurface. But drought had undone their work, pulling the secret back into the light, and the disappearances were proof that the curse still demanded payment. The cover-up theory grew stronger when a whistleblower from the state's Department of Natural Resources claimed that divers had been sent into the lake during the early 1980s for structural inspections. According to him, those divers never returned. Their bodies were never recovered, and their names never made it into public record. When pressed, the whistleblower claimed their last radio transmission had been garbled but contained a single phrase repeated 3 times: shoes everywhere. The man who leaked this information vanished weeks later. Officials said he had relocated out of state, but no forwarding address was ever found. Public trust in the state collapsed. Locals accused officials of valuing secrecy over safety, of allowing people to vanish rather than risk the truth emerging. Lawsuits were filed, but none gained traction. Each was dismissed due to insufficient evidence, despite piles of testimonies and photographic proof. For many, this only deepened their conviction: there was an active effort to keep the drowned town's secret buried, and those who threatened to expose it risked becoming part of the lake's legend themselves. And yet, even as the theories multiplied, no consensus formed. Was it folklore bleeding into reality, spirits demanding tribute, or a government conspiracy cloaked in water. Each theory clashed with the next, but all shared a single haunting thread: the shoes. They remained the one element that could not be rationalized away, the quiet, undeniable symbol that haunted every version of the story. Rows of them, patient, waiting, lined at doorways where no one would ever return. For those who believed in cover-ups, the fear was not only that the truth was being hidden, but that the cover-up itself ensured the cycle would never end. If the drowned town's secret was never exposed, it would never be resolved. And so long as it remained unresolved, the disappearances would continue, the shoes would keep appearing, and the lake would claim more lives, until someone finally uncovered what lay at the heart of the valley's darkness. The early 2000s brought strange shifts to the reservoir once more. After years of drought and unsettling discoveries, heavy rains came in a season unlike any locals had ever seen. Storm after storm pummeled the valley, swelling rivers, flooding fields, and pouring relentlessly into the dam. The lake that had been shrinking seemed suddenly alive, growing restless, as if eager to swallow everything again. Within weeks, the ruins of the town that had drawn so many visitors, the church steeple, the skeleton houses, the silent school, disappeared beneath rising black waters. By mid-spring, the shoreline was unrecognizable. It was as though the valley had pulled a curtain across its own secrets. At first, many residents breathed a sigh of relief. For years, the exposed town had been a magnet for dark tourism and unexplainable disappearances. With the ruins submerged again, people hoped that the horrors would be buried, sealed under the reservoir for good. But their relief was short-lived. Fishermen began reporting unusual currents, deep rumbles that shook their boats, as though something massive moved beneath them. Divers sent to inspect the dam reported visibility so poor it was like descending into ink. One diver emerged trembling, refusing to go back in, muttering only, "There are shapes down there, and they're not ruins." In the months that followed, the water itself seemed to change. Once a clear, reflective surface, it grew murky, clouded with strange sediments. Dead fish washed up in clusters along the shore, their bodies marked with unusual abrasions, as if they had scraped against stone walls that shouldn't exist underwater. Residents began to say that the water smelled different too, sharp, metallic, like old blood. Scientists tested samples but found nothing abnormal, fueling suspicions that either the tests were tampered with or the lake's true nature could not be measured by ordinary means. Then came the sounds. Campers swore that on still nights, when the lake was perfectly calm, they could hear church bells tolling beneath the surface. Others described the faint laughter of children, drifting across the water in the early hours of dawn. A sheriff's deputy on night patrol reported seeing lights flickering under the water, like lanterns swaying along long drowned streets. Each account was dismissed by officials as imagination, but privately, even the deputies admitted their unease. One officer quit the force after claiming he saw a procession of shadowy figures walking just beneath the surface, their heads bent as if in prayer, their shoes dragging along the muddy bottom. National attention returned to the lake when a group of university students staged an unauthorized exploration. Equipped with drones and underwater cameras, they hoped to document the ruins more thoroughly than ever before. Their live stream began with laughter and excitement, but within an hour their tone shifted. The drone footage showed what appeared to be intact doorways, lined just as before with shoes. The students laughed nervously, calling it proof of the legend. But minutes later, the feed cut abruptly. Their boat was found drifting near the center of the lake the next morning, their equipment intact but all 5 students missing. On the boat's deck sat a neat row of shoes, not just the students' own, but additional pairs no one could account for. The story spread like wildfire. Conspiracy forums exploded, journalists descended, and locals grew restless with fear. The authorities once again tightened access, declaring the lake a restricted zone, due to infrastructure concerns. But few believed this explanation. Many suspected the restrictions were meant to keep people away not for safety, but to prevent more proof from surfacing. What unsettled people most was how cleanly the incident mirrored earlier events: shoes lined up, lives erased, silence where answers should have been. The cycle had begun again. As the waters settled into their new swollen state, elders in the community began to speak more openly about what they had always feared. Some claimed that the town beneath had not merely drowned but had been transformed into something else, a place between worlds. The rain, they said, had fed the lake, given it strength to grow not only deeper but hungrier. One elderly man compared it to a sealed coffin. The water is the lid. Every time it rises, the dead inside grow restless, pressing up against it. He died a month later, and at his funeral, mourners reported seeing a pair of shoes left neatly by the church door, though no one admitted to placing them there. Perhaps the most chilling development came from satellite images. Analysts noticed that during peak rainfall, when the reservoir reached record highs, the outline of the lake seemed to shift shape. Instead of following the expected contours of the valley, the water's surface bulged in unnatural patterns, forming what looked like streets, blocks, and grids. To some, it resembled a living map of the drowned town trying to imprint itself on the surface world. Officials denied the claims, insisting it was a trick of light and shadow. But for those who had studied the lake for decades, it was further proof that the town was no longer simply lying beneath the waters, it was trying to rise through them. Local legends flourished again, but now they carried an edge of urgency. People whispered that the return of the waters was not a return at all, but a preparation. The town, they said, was no longer content to be glimpsed only in drought. It wanted permanence, visibility. Some claimed the rising waters meant the drowned town was now larger, expanding beyond its old boundaries, swallowing more land with each passing season. If true, it meant the curse was no longer contained to the valley. It was spreading. For the families of the missing, the lake's expansion only deepened their despair. Each rainfall seemed to erase hope, washing away footprints, concealing evidence, and dragging the truth further out of reach. Memorials were held at the shoreline, shoes placed in rows as silent tributes to those who had vanished. But each morning after these vigils, locals found the shoes rearranged, lined up differently, as though someone, or something, had come in the night to claim them. The return of the waters was not a relief, as many had hoped. It was a warning. The drowned town was no longer a relic of the past revealed by drought, it was an active presence, expanding, evolving, and erasing all who dared trespass. And as the lake grew deeper, so too did the shadow it cast across the community. Few said it aloud, but more and more began to wonder, if the waters continued to rise, what would surface next? They say that objects remember what people forget. Long after voices vanish and faces fade from memory, the things they once touched, used, or left behind remain like silent witnesses to lives lived and moments lost. When the waters of the lake receded and the town re-emerged, it wasn't just broken houses and abandoned walls that caught attention, it was the shoes. Lined at doorsteps, scattered along thresholds, left in neat pairs as if their owners had stepped out only for a moment, they became the most haunting symbol of the town's return. The shoes came in every shape and size. Small leather boots, scuffed from years of wear, belonging to children who may have once run down dusty roads or splashed along the shallow edges of the lake. Heavy work shoes, the soles worn thin, telling stories of men who labored in fields or hauled goods across town. Women's slippers, delicate and now eaten away by water and rot, hinted at lives spent maintaining households or attending community gatherings. Every shoe, though mute, seemed to whisper a fragment of a story that had long been submerged beneath the lake. For locals, the shoes quickly became a symbol of both memory and unease. Some elders who visited the site claimed they recognized pairs that once belonged to neighbors or relatives. One man said he saw the very boots his uncle used to wear when fishing by the shore, the laces still tied the same way. Another woman claimed she spotted her childhood shoes, left behind when her family was evacuated decades earlier, still resting near the doorway of their former home. Whether their memories were accurate or shaped by nostalgia and the surreal power of the moment, no one could say. But the emotional impact was undeniable. The shoes bridged the gap between past and present in a way that crumbling bricks and rotting wood could not. Yet the shoes also raised darker questions. Why were so many left behind so deliberately? Some pairs were placed neatly by doorways, as though the owners had known they would never return. Others were abandoned haphazardly, as if dropped in haste during a desperate flight. The town had been evacuated, yes, but the shoes carried a strange, ritual-like weight. Investigators, folklorists, and journalists who flocked to the site after the town reappeared couldn't resist drawing symbolic interpretations. Shoes, after all, are more than just objects of utility. They represent journeys, life paths, and identity. To leave one's shoes behind, especially in such great numbers, seemed to echo a ritual of parting or a silent resignation to fate. The haunting presence of the shoes attracted the attention of paranormal enthusiasts as well. Some claimed that the town's watery grave had preserved not just its physical remnants but also the memories and spirits of those who once lived there. Shoes, being so intimately tied to the human body, became seen as vessels for lingering energies. Visitors reported an eerie feeling when walking among them, like being watched by unseen eyes, or as if the shoes themselves remembered who had worn them. In hushed tones, some even claimed to hear faint footsteps echoing along the broken streets when no one was around, as though the town still pulsed with life in some spectral form. For historians, however, the shoes presented an invaluable yet challenging archive. Each pair offered potential clues about the lives once lived here, the fashions of the time, the quality of materials, the socio-economic conditions of families. Some shoes were crafted from fine leather, indicating relative wealth, while others were patched repeatedly, evidence of thrift and hardship. Forensic analysts who examined them noted how certain patterns of wear suggested the labor their owners had performed, heels worn unevenly by those who stood for long hours, or soles caked with remnants of soil even decades later. In this sense, the shoes were more than eerie artifacts, they were living documents of the town's vanished community. But not all reactions were reverent. Tourists began arriving, drawn by curiosity and the viral spread of images on social media. Many came to see the strange phenomenon of the drowned town revealed, but the shoes, especially, became a grotesque attraction. Some visitors were respectful, whispering as they walked among the ruins. Others treated the site like a backdrop for photos, snapping selfies with the rows of shoes or even attempting to take a pair as a souvenir. Stories spread of shoes disappearing, stolen under cover of night, their new owners perhaps unaware, or uncaring, of the weight of history they carried. This sparked outrage among locals, who viewed the shoes not as trinkets but as sacred relics of lives uprooted and lost. Local authorities eventually stepped in, cordoning off sections of the town to prevent further disturbance. Still, the shoes remained, deteriorating slowly in the open air now that the waters no longer covered them. Each rainstorm, each gust of wind, chipped away at their fragile remains, reminding observers that nothing, not even memory, could last forever untouched. Preservationists debated whether to collect and conserve them in a museum, to catalogue each pair as an artifact. Others argued that the shoes belonged to the town itself, not to be removed from the place where they had waited for so long. In the midst of these debates, one lingering question refused to fade: why did so many families leave their shoes behind at all? Some survivors suggested that when the order came to evacuate, people simply had no time to pack everything. Shoes, being heavy and often waterlogged, were sacrificed in the rush to save more essential belongings. Others believed it was an act of silent protest or grief, a way for families to leave a part of themselves anchored to the homes they were abandoning forever. A folkloric interpretation gained traction too, that the shoes had been left to confuse or appease spirits, ensuring safe passage from the cursed waters that would soon claim the town. The more one looked at the shoes, the less they seemed like ordinary objects. They became markers of absence, standing in for the people who had once filled the streets with noise, laughter, and routine. Without those people, the shoes looked tragically out of place, like stage props left behind after the actors had departed, the story forever unfinished. In their silence, they spoke louder than any words could, reminding visitors not only of the fragility of human life but also of the inevitability of loss. And yet, Amid the haunting atmosphere, there was also a strange beauty. The shoes, aligned along thresholds, created a poetic image of departure, of lives that had once paused at the doorway, only to never return. It was a picture both heartbreaking and mesmerizing, one that compelled visitors to photograph, document, and remember. The shoes turned the drowned town from a forgotten tragedy into an enduring symbol, a reminder that even when entire communities vanish, their traces remain in the most unexpected forms. By the time the sun set each evening, casting long shadows across the ruined streets, the shoes seemed almost alive again. In the dim light, they resembled figures standing guard, waiting patiently for their owners to return. And as the night deepened, with the sound of water lapping at the distant shore, one couldn't help but feel that the town was not entirely empty. It was as if the shoes, and the stories they carried, kept the place inhabited, by memory, by mystery, by echoes of a life that would never fully fade. When visitors left the site, many confessed that the image of those shoes lingered in their minds long after. They haunted dreams, stirred questions, and evoked a melancholy that was hard to shake. For some, the shoes were simply remnants of a tragic event, nothing more. But for others, they became something greater, a symbol of resilience, of presence in absence, of the strange ways history insists on being remembered. And so, even as the lake's waters threatened to rise again, ready to swallow the town and its relics once more, the shoes remained. Silent, patient, enduring, waiting at their doorways like watchful guardians of a forgotten world.